are listening to Fika with Vicky on United Public Radio, 107.7 and 105.3 from New Orleans.
Everyone, and welcome to Fika. Our guest today is author Sarah Archer. This is a return visit to Fika for Sarah, her fourth visit, actually, and it's always fun when she joins us. I can't wait to start chatting, but first, introductions, because that is the proper way of doing things. Sarah is an author of short stories and novels, a poet, a screenwriter, a blogger, an instructor in the art of writing, and co-host on the award-winning Charlotte Readers podcast. You'll want to check out her site, Sarah Archer Writes, and its address is scrolling across the bottom of the screen here, but if you can't see the screen, I'm sure if you put those words, Sarah Archer Writes, into search, you'll get there. And when you get there, you'll want to check out her blog. There is a link to her ebook of poems, Weird Women, that I love, as well as several writing articles that are very helpful, including 7 Reasons to Write a Short Story, which is where I found out that Sarah was a mutual fan of Alice Munro. So we decided to do a chat about her the way we did Ray Bradbury. Alice Munro, known as a master of short stories, was born in Wingham, Ontario, Canada, and won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2013. And yes, that's a short bio, but we'll be uncovering more about her throughout the next hour. And hopefully, if you're not already a fan, entice you to take a peek at her short stories. Thank you for helping with this, Sarah. And welcome to Fika.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks for having me back on. I always have so much fun talking to you. And thanks for suggesting this. I had read one of Alice's books, but this really gave me a good excuse to dig more into her work and just reignited my love for her work. And yeah, this is a lot of fun.
So although we're going raw and off the cuff here, I just want to ask to start off, what did attract you to Alice? How did you find out about her?
So the first collection of hers I had read it's a long title. It's Hate Ship, Friendship, Courtship, Love Ship, Marriage. I think I'm getting that right. We've got if you're watching the live version, you can see the cover. But someone gave me that book several years ago, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And I had heard her name before, but I had never read her, which is kind of shameful given that she's such a luminary, and a Nobel Prize winner and very well regarded.
We have no shame at Fika.
That's good.
Whenever we get there.
Shed your shame. I like that.
Slogan, shed your shame at Fika.
Yeah, that could be your new mantra.
I'm going to get it, and I'm going to put your little name underneath it. And
nice, thank you. I like the no judgment attitude, but I had never read her before, and I just loved her writing, and we can talk about, I guess, what we enjoyed about her work, but I immediately fell in love with her work. And at the time when I read that collection, I was not as much into short stories as I am now. Over the last couple of years, I've started writing short stories myself and reading more of them and really kind of fallen in love just with that format. But even just her writing itself, before I was kind of at that point when I was focusing more on novels, I just loved her prose, how she gets into her characters, her kind of unusual approach to structure. There's so much about her work that I love. And now I've read a couple more books of hers now that we're doing this. I'm excited to keep reading her work too in the future.
Yes, no, definitely. I can see why, having read your writing, particularly your short stories, I can see why you would be drawn to her. She has that same earthy feel that your stories.
And she's such a character writer, which I think for me is always like a good story is crucial in a lot of ways. But for me, if I have to pick strong story or strong characters, I'll always go for characters. And she's such a good character writer. Her people just feel so real.
I think they are.
Yeah.
They are real people. For me, it was about 4 years ago, and I was doing a Fika with a proprietor of a rare book and used book store online.
Okay.
And he was talking about the fact that we shouldn't just, the books that we're given in school to read are not necessarily the best books. And
Mm-hmm.
read with him, but I said, but I really like Steinbeck, and he writes about real people and real things. And he said, have you read Alice Munro? And I said, no. And he said, read her.
Mm-hmm.
He was very straightforward, so I didn't think of it. No. I went, and I believe it was this book I got out of the library, but you started to I remember.
I'm losing your audio a little bit. I'm not sure
Okay.
if you can hear me. Oh, there you are. There you are.
I'm here. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So, and I liked her for the same reasons. The characters.
Mm-hmm.
I also liked her because she grew up in Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
in a rural type of area, and I did as well. So it was almost like looking at the characters in my life again through the things I had learned about the characters in her books, or just going, So there was a lot of humming for me, and definitely that gritty, real people, real working people kind of story that I like.
Yeah. I was curious to kind of pick your brain about that too, like having grown up in Canada. I mean, her settings and her people, like I said, feel so real to me, but I'm not as familiar with those communities. But are there areas that you recognize? Are there like little details of the daily lives of the characters that you recognize from your own upbringing?
Originally, just when she talks about, now I grew up in a different part of Southern Ontario, so she was Western
Mm-hmm.
Ontario, but just certain things or smells she'll bring up about driving down the road or whatever is very familiar. Also, sometimes you wonder when people talk about female roles why I turned out the way that I did. Not necessarily, but and this sort of goes back to our Ray Bradbury talk. She talks about the women on the farms, and they were the ones that read. They were, because the men were outside doing the important stuff. So they were the ones that read and taught school and wrote and did all of these things. Like, you would go to Sunday school and it would be your female teachers, and I think I was in grade 7 before I had a male teacher. So it didn't seem weird to you that women were doing these things, because that is what they did, and discussed different passages or whatever in different books. So that is different than perhaps when she went into the world of academia, where that was a man's area more. And so that would have been quite an eye-opener for her, I think.
That's such an interesting distinction, that like the kind of everyday education, it's almost more of the women's domain there, but then once you get to the higher levels with the kind of ivory tower academia, it was a little bit more weighted towards the men. But that's such a theme that comes out a lot in her work, I think, is sort of the conflict between having an intellectual life versus having a domestic life, and weaving those things together. And I would imagine for her, that was something probably very personal. I know she was married, she had kids, and she was also, running her writing career at the same time. But she has a lot of characters who sort of grapple with that tension of maintaining some sort of inner space and inner life for themselves, and having a life of the mind and creative pursuits. A lot of her characters are women who are writers, but also they're taking care of children and aging parents and spouses and having friendships, and the sort of expectations of the societies and communities that they live in sometimes rub up against their more inner goals.
I agree. It's not always, we look at it as it being the husband's fault. He is definitely, which brings us back to another subject. What I like about her books is there is no judgment on the characters. There are no good characters or bad characters. They are just people, and this is how they live. And I think that's really interesting, because you're really allowed to, you have a pug, right?
Yes, sorry.
I was thinking,
He
like,
just started barking in the
what
distance.
kind of dog does Sarah have? Because it sounded like a bit of a hound at first, and then,
He's small, but he has a mighty bark.
he'll keep strangers at bay. That is for
Yes,
sure.
squirrels at least.
So she said that both of her husbands were very positive towards her writing and bought her a typewriter and that. But the problem was not in being a housewife, she didn't care about, but that people, and I was a stay-at-home mom, so I'm understanding this completely. People think you're open for business all the time. So when you want to think, when you want to do their things, the phone calls ring, and she says you can't just shoo people away because you want to think. I'm thinking now, I wish I had shooed more people away. And but there's just solitary, somebody else is having problems with their kids or something, and you want to be helpful. But yeah, it's definitely, I think she had a better grasp on that than a lot of her characters do when I read some of the interviews and things from her.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I haven't read it, but I think her oldest daughter actually wrote a memoir about her life growing up with Alice as her mother. And she, I believe her name is Sheila, if I'm not mistaken, Sheila Munro. She said something. I was doing some Googling and some research on Alice and her family beforehand, and she said something about how she would like come downstairs or come to the kitchen or something, and her mom would be writing in a notebook, but she would always immediately like put the notebook away and make breakfast and do whatever the kids needed. So it seemed like she was very much in that mode of, this comes first, and I'm not going to shoo people away. I'm going to take care of the people who need to be taken care of, and then finding the space for her writing life around that. And she still managed to write, maybe I think 12 collections of stories.
I
very long
believe 163 stories were published altogether. But I mean, that's once again looking here and that for research, and I don't want to say it's 163. I haven't counted them, but that's the number that I found.
Yeah.
So she had.
Well, I read that her father, he was, I believe, a fox and mink farmer for most of the time when she was growing up, which is interesting. That's one of the characters in Lives of Girls and Women. The father is a fox farmer, I believe. So that was probably drawn somewhat from her own life. But he worked as a farmer most of his life, and then when he was, I believe, in his 70s, he started writing, and he published a novel later in life. So even in her life, there's a precedent for seeing men who also had to kind of put their creative pursuits and their individual pursuits aside for work and family. So I think that she sees that as a kind of universal struggle, but a lot of her characters are women, her main characters. So she kind of specifically looks at that mostly through the female lens.
I think so. And it is true, because it was a working class family, and in working class families, you don't have a lot of time for extras, right? And it's not that you see yourself as sacrificing that at the time because you want to make breakfast for the kids. I mean, you don't want them to starve or whatever. And if I was the mother putting the journal away quickly, it was probably because I didn't want anybody else to read what I was putting there. You make a code. This person's name is now Tiger, and just in case she fall into enemy hands. But that's what I'm saying. It is very important, an important fact that she sees how all the little parts of humanity fall together, and waiting for retirement. I mean, even now we see many retired people writing to their animals. They're okay. Ben Stimson would like to say, and I just want to say, Ben's going to be coming up on the show in a couple of weeks. I'm waiting. Oh, nice. I'm making him wait for his review. No.
Making him work for it.
Okay. Some of our most early female writers and thinkers were from rural settings. Nellie McClung, for example, McClune, and Lucy Maud Montgomery. And it's true. It's definitely true. And I wonder I wonder, well, they would probably have more time on their hands, right? I mean, long winters out in a rural area, time
That's a
to
good
think
point.
and meditate, not be with their friends all the time.
Yeah, and Monroe's writing also reminded me a lot of Flannery O'Connor, who I'm actually not sure exactly where she grew up, but most of her stories are in a more rural setting, so I'd imagine that she spent time there. But yeah, I really enjoy those writers who are good at capturing kind of ordinary life, and it's not necessarily famous people or politicians that they're writing about, or sorry, my dog's barking. But the little things in life. The dog's barking in the background. These are the things of daily life. But I think, yeah, Monroe is so good at capturing that and finding the ways to make it, to show how it's important and to show how this kind of makes us who we are, I think.
And definitely that is what I get out of reading that. And as we were discussing earlier, I was pointing out that we're all approximately 30 years apart, like Alice Munro, then me, then you. And yet she wrote those words, and we are still finding them interesting today from different perspectives and different backgrounds. So she definitely speaks to a large group of individuals. I found this fact from 90 Things About Alice Munro You Must Know from CBC. And a reviewer had apparently talked about the fact that she doesn't write about extraordinary people. She writes about nurses and civil servants. And she said, I like that. Everyone is extraordinary to themselves. Nurses have about the most dramatic life I can think of. I never consider these people ordinary, but then I never meet anybody that I consider ordinary.
I love that. Yeah, I think I always like to think that real people are always so much more complex than even the most complex and interesting and well-developed character. And so I think just by really depicting people as they are, and I don't know how much of her work and her characters was based on like actual literal real people she knew, but they certainly feel real, and just the kind of substance of their daily lives and the choices they make and the ways that they relate to each other, she finds what's fascinating in that.
Well, I think, okay, Brian is here. I have something to say to him. But I'm happy you're here, and it's a good thing, Brian. I'll get back to your question in just a second. I have seen many people say that her work is a memoir, but a lot of the characters are changed up enough in the stories that I've read that I think she sort of interchanges them and changes them a little bit, and in some of the stories. But I know in the hate ship, love ship, courtship, I'm not going through the entire collection. I know that the story Family Furnishings, I believe, was about her aunt, and there's a couple of quotes in that I loved. We'll take Brian's comment first. Brian, I have to wonder about how the cultural environment affects one's writing style. Example, rural versus online oriented. And good question, Brian. Would you like to have an opinion on that, Sarah?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think one thing that really strikes me about Monroe's work is that it's very sensory. Like, she picks up on the sensory details of nature, of the environment around her, of cooking, of like the things in the house. And maybe that is related in some ways to being in a rural environment. At least she's writing from life, it feels like, so those details feel very authentic. But also maybe some of it brings out more of that kind of, I hesitate to say slower pace because that makes it sound like there's nothing happening, but paying attention to the small things because you're not in like a hectic city where there's big stuff happening around you all the time. Maybe that gives her more space to kind of focus on the little moments in the characters' lives that actually make them who they are. Like, there's one character in Lives of Girls and Women, I think his name is Uncle Benny, even though he's not actually their uncle. Everyone just calls him Uncle Benny. But he gets all of his news from a newspaper, but it's not like a regular newspaper. It's sort of it's not a celebrity tabloid, but it's one of those tabloids. I don't know if you used to see these in the grocery stores, but they'd
like
have
the Inquirer and
things
like that.
Alien baby is born in Utah, like those sorts of headlines. And so this character gets all of his news from those. He has like no other connection to the outside world, and because they're in this small rural town in Canada, like he really doesn't know anything about real life other than these crazy headlines that he's reading, which is something that you couldn't really have if you're setting your story in a city and people are more exposed to other people and other influences. But I think that sense of isolation sometimes helps create these really interesting characters as well.
Well, and there is the idea when he says that example rural versus online oriented, that when you talk about writing what you know, it's harder to know, to touch, to feel, to have that sensory idea with an online experience. You're not, feeling that sun, that first peach picked off of the tree, that kind of thing. So it allows her to be more sensory oriented, I think, which is what I love about her work, because it's just like, oh, I remember that. And so it definitely has that kind of feel. The quote,
that's true.
The quote at the end of Family Furnishings, she wrote, "I did not think of the story I would make of Frida, not of that in particular, but of the work I wanted to do, which seemed more like grabbing something out of the air than constructing stories. The cries of the crowd came to me like a big heartbeat, full of sorrows, lovely formal sounding waves with their distant, almost inhuman assent and lamentation. This is what I wanted. This was what I thought I had to pay attention to. This is how I wanted my life to be." So I definitely think that story was more of a memoir, and I want my life to be that too. She's just, because she does that. She creates that. So did you want to go through some of the stories and sort of talk about the characters and what we think?
Sure.
How they have, because okay, I'm going to say something that I think about her writing, and then you do. Okay. I feel in her writing, love isn't so much as a thing. There are no big loves. There are these little tiny loves for different reasons, and sometimes we get into them because of loving ourselves a little too much. But and I'll be judgment there. But
a little judgment is fine.
But love causes movement in the life. It always causes movement.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I think that the way that she writes about love is it can be very, very tender and real, but it's also never saccharine, and it's never sort of glossed over or romanticized. I think if I had to pick one story of hers that I read that would be my favorite, it's The Bear Came Over the Mountain, which is the last story in Hate Ship, Friendship, Courtship, Love Ship, Marriage. I would say to anyone who has not read her work, I think so. I think I passed. But if you read one story of hers, that would be the one that I recommend. But it's a story that deals with love and relationships in a very kind of unusual way, but in a way that to me was also very touching. And it's about this older couple, a man and a woman, and I think they both work in academia. Maybe they've always both had very sort of rich intellectual lives, and that's a big part of their connection. And now the woman has developed over time some form of dementia, and she ends up having to go away to a nursing home. And when she's there, it's kind of hard when the man is visiting her for him to be able to tell what she actually knows or remembers. Does she recognize him? Does she know that he's her husband? And she develops a romance with this other guy there in the nursing home who's kind of like her new boyfriend. And so the husband becomes sort of a bystander watching this develop. But then he also has his own history of infidelity that kind of comes out in some ways over the story. And it's very complex, and but she still really develops, despite all the complications, this sense of like such a strong abiding love between husband and wife that to me was very affecting. So she's, I think, almost because she acknowledges the harder sides of relationships and doesn't try to romanticize too much. I think when she gets at the real love at the core of those relationships, it's more powerful to me than in a more sort of like glitzy, like everything is sweet kind of romantic story.
Well, I'm going to do some spoilers because I already decided to do this because one, I don't think you actually read her stories to get to the end. You read her stories for the journey. And second of all, because the books have been out for quite a long time. And so if you haven't read them already, you know.
Get with it.
Get with it. So I'm not going to stop. But the idea of love is definitely questioned there because he cheated on her and he cheated on her several times. And then at the end, even though she doesn't remember him and she's in love with this other individual in the home, that he goes to bring him back to her because she will be happier. So in the end, her happiness, her health is more important to him than how he feels about the relationship. And I think that shows that he values her.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I also love what you said about how you don't necessarily read her stories to get to the ending. And I would love to hear what you think about her endings. They're a little bit ambiguous a lot of times. And she said something, I found a quote where she said something about she writes to get to, she wants to get a feeling of mystery or surprise, not a mystery that finishes the reader off, but something that makes the character or reader wonder. And I think that really comes through in a lot of her stories. Like they don't have a neat conclusion where everything's tied up with a bow, but she always has the best ending lines. I love her ending lines and images that she uses.
That is what I wanted. That was the work I wanted to do.
Yeah.
No, because there was one point while reading this that I'm like, wait, did I finish that story? I don't remember the ending to a story ahead of it. And then I realized I did. It just wasn't your normal ending. So yes, she does do that. But yet you still feel fulfilled.
Yeah,
you definitely feel fulfilled.
And I think her structure in general is kind of unusual. She doesn't really follow like a typical beginning, middle, end, like here's an inciting incident, here's a climax sort of story structure. Yeah, it's almost like from the quote that you said, I think she said something about I was pulling stuff out of the air, and that's what her stories feel like. She's collecting these pieces and putting them together in a way that's cohesive, but it's not necessarily a traditional like linear narrative structure.
Yeah, I thought I had the direct quote here, but she did say at some point, I just start a story wherever I can get into it, which applies perfectly to what you say. I mean, it's just, that's where it started for me. So
yeah, she makes it work.
Yeah, she makes it all work. But apparently, like, she is very seldom happy with the story. She's pulled books back from publishers when editors said, because she wanted to change from first, third to third point of view, I think, or vice versa. And she paid a penalty for doing it because it was already in printing, because she wanted that changed. And so this is just, that's what she does. And she won't show anybody her work while it's in progress. So,
I can understand that. I don't like to show anybody anything.
Don't criticize it yet.
Yeah. Criticize it later. No, I read that about her too, that she's kind of a relentless reviser, and she'll rewrite things even once they've already been printed. She'll do a rewrite and reprint it later, and not even just small changes of the wording here and there, but she'll make characters like different ages. She'll make significant revisions, and her editors had to talk about how he will have to tell her, like, no, it's done, like it's good, just let it go, and she doesn't want to let it go, which I think it's something you can.
It's perfect.
Yeah,
like
we have to print something. Yeah, but I guess she's a perfectionist with her work, which, I mean,
it shows.
The final product shows.
It shows. It definitely shows.
Yeah.
You know what? Well, I'll get to that after. Brian would like to know, Sarah, as a screenwriter, do you see Alice's stories as something that would translate well to a video, example, TV format?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I had read that I think maybe 5 of her stories at different points have been adapted into film. So I know some of them have been adapted. I haven't actually seen any of those. I think a lot of her work is not something that is like a clear, easy translation to a visual format because so much of it is internal. And so much for me about what I love about the writing is about the way that she describes the inner lives of the characters, which is obviously harder to depict on screen where you're looking at somebody from the outside. But it can be done. You know, it might just require more kind of changing and figuring out how to put things into the dialogue than and some other adaptations. But there, you know, there are works like that that have been adapted really successfully. Like the one I always think back on is The Remains of the Day. Have you ever read or watched that?
No, I don't think so. But like I said, I forget a lot.
It's so the movie was with it's about like this, I think, 19th century butler, and he's very sort of prim and proper in the movie. Anthony Hopkins plays the character. And then there's this woman who works in the household. Emma Thompson plays her character in the movie. It's kind of about like their relationship and how he comes out of his shell in some ways. But both the book and the movie are wonderful. But if you read the book first, I would never think that it would make a good movie because it's another one of those things that's very internal, and so much of it is about the fact that these characters keep everything inside, and yet they still manage to make it into a great movie. So I think that her work could work well on screen, but it would definitely require a writer who knows what they're doing. It's not like a straightforward
Can
adaptation.
imagine this as like already has the way to go there. And also like Coraline, Neil Gaiman's, they actually added a character to be who she talked to because it was so
Yeah,
internal. And
I
so
didn't know that it was based on a book.
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And
cool.
and so they added the little boy to so she would have someone to talk to. Now,
Yeah,
Brian,
interesting.
just for you, I thought I would search and find out if she was a pantser or a plotter. And I got this information from her because you always ask that from her uh, from her lecture, Alice in My Own Words, at the Nobel Prize, and they asked her, when you start a story, do you always have it planned out? And she said, I do, but then it often changes. I start with a plot and I work at it. And then I see that it goes another way and things happen as I'm writing the story. But at least I have to start out with a fairly clear idea of what the story is about. So I would say she is a plotter. And then, like all plots, they go aside. But she would feel
Yeah,
that way. So,
that's interesting because I guess that makes sense because she is a perfectionist with her writing and she seems very deliberate with it. But because she also has that feeling like she's just pulling things out of the air, like we said, like it almost feels like she's just sort of sitting down and it's flowing out of her. But I guess there's a much more intentional architecture behind it.
yeah, well, I think it was her. I can't remember. I do so much research, but I seem to remember reading that someone said when editing her book, like they would say at the beginning, okay, they would take out a section because it isn't important to the story. And then 37 pages in, that detail needed to be told. Like that's
Yeah.
how intricate her work is. Now,
Yeah, well, and her plotting too. I mean, short stories, especially these days, tend to be much more kind of focused and simple, but she'll cover years or decades of time within a short story, which is it's tough to do. But I mean, she packs a lot in there into a small space.
she does. She is the most amazing. I am such an Alice Munro fan. Okay. More importantly, Brian wants to know, is she a dog person or a cat person? And sometimes people will say to me, aren't you kind of mean to Brian? And I will say, but look at, I just answered one question from him and he throws me one from, oh, I don't know, Brian. That wasn't something that I researched. I think it's
Brian is the best.
I think it's a very personal thing. So, okay, now I have to live with him. Sarah says I'm the best. No, I don't
Gold
actually
star
live
for
with him.
him.
I mean, in life. Okay,
Yeah,
Brian is
yeah.
in my writer's sub. It's just a couple of weeks ago. I said I'm allowed to talk to them like that. That's my husband and my friend. And then
Mhm.
Brian said immediately afterwards, "You didn't say who was your husband and who was your friend." Obviously, not wanting people to think that he's married to me. And then my husband said right after I went down the stairs, "You didn't say who was your husband and who was your friend." Obviously, because he wanted people to know he was married to me. And I'm like, do they have a club?
You have to issue a disclaimer in the next episode.
Yes. So I have cleared that up. Brian is my friend. All the men around here should be happy now. Okay. So back to the thing. So, yes, with the stories, and particularly in this book, it
Mhm.
is each and every story has a way that love moved the people and not
Mhm.
in the ways. So I'm going to take the original story, which is of course called Hate Ship, Friendship, Courtship, Love Ship, Marriage,
Mhm.
and talk about the fact that here was someone entering old maid age, and because of the prey of some teenage girls, she ended up getting married,
Mhm.
and how that worked. Now, anyone that saw Joanna on the street or talked to her would see her as a very gruff individual.
Mhm.
And yet, throughout the story, we realize what a caregiver she is and how much she will give of herself to love someone.
Mhm.
She has been a caregiver in the future, and how she panned out. It panned out in her marriage, which didn't turn out to be what people would consider a great romantic love, but it probably worked really well for them. They both saw what they were
Yeah.
getting out of this.
Yeah, and that story is so interesting because, like we said, she doesn't really have clear-cut endings a lot of times, but overall, I would say it's a pretty happy ending, at least within the scope of Alice Munro stories. And it's such an unusual way that this couple comes together, and there's deception, and there's, they're not necessarily clearly well matched initially, but by the end you feel like, yeah, I'm like happy that they're together and this is going to work and this is a good marriage, and somehow in this weird twisty way fate brought them together. Yeah, I just think that was another one of my favorites in that collection too. It's such a it takes you on a real journey and you don't really quite know where it's going to end up.
Practically speaking, that would be a great love because they
Mhm.
would be working together. Like she had no problems with putting work into a relationship.
Mhm.
That's what she did. So she just thought. And thinking about that, as you said earlier, is there a part of the rural experience that would, when I wasn't actually on a farm, we didn't own a cow. We lived in the
Mhm.
rural area, but my father worked at a factory in town. So I can't say from personal experience, but I know with a lot of the boys in that, finding someone to marry that would stay on the farm, that would do those practical things, was a big
Mhm.
thing. And now out in Western Canada, they have a show actually, about farmers trying to
Really?
find a mate to live on the farm. It's not The Bachelor, definitely, but it um oh is a thing. So like you can almost see how that was transferred to this
Mhm.
story, that idea of a practical marriage that
Yeah, and I think one of the things that makes that really work in the story too, and one of just my favorite things in her writing in general, is the descriptions of the domesticity. She writes like great descriptions of. Sorry, you can probably hear my dog snorting. Um, he's in the chair behind me. Like cooking, cleaning, the ways that characters kind of fit out their houses, these really sort of detailed tactile descriptions. Like I love in that story the part where Joanna goes to this guy's house and he's living in kind of in shambles and he's sick, and she comes in and she just like takes over and cleans the house and finds ways to cook for him out of the weird kind of odds and ends that he has around in the kitchen. And I love reading that stuff, like the descriptions of like, oh, she'll scrub the windows with newspaper and vinegar, and the kind of like old timey home stuff. And it's so detailed, and it's not romanticized and made out to be sort of.
It just is.
Yeah, it just is. It just is, and it feels very real. And it makes you almost respect the character, because you're like, she's willing to literally get her hands dirty and just put in the work. And a lot of her characters, I think, are like that.
And on a more inner level, putting work into a relationship is what makes it work. I mean, it's never, you're not going to have a long-term relationship if you're not willing to take that shovel and shovel things away. Like when Brian says, great minds think alike. Okay, do not be upset about your dog. And Sarah says, having your dog on the show. Jen says, having your dog on the show, your dog on your lap is quite endearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I appreciate that. And William appreciates that too. He agrees. He is quite endearing.
He has, it's that name that gives him the bark, okay? Because he has like this big, important name.
He has gravitas.
He has to live up to it.
Yes, he has a presence.
when you bring up the domestic, I can't talk today. Okay, when you bring up being good with household chores, I'll just make the word go away.
Same thing.
Which reminds me of home furnishings, the story about Elfrida, because she did everything she could to get away from the family, it seemed, and yet in the end she had circled herself with all the things it meant to be that her family of origin, right? That reminded her, almost like souvenirs of that life. So it is an important part of her writing, and when it's jam season, or someone, honestly, she can make a ketchup sandwich sound good.
Yeah. I do. I love the food descriptions in her work, because a lot of times it's slightly old-fashioned, and it's not quite what people would eat, at least today where I live and where I've grown up. Or
tell anyone.
But, yeah, that's true. But she has a way of creating these very detailed food descriptions that also feel just very apt for the characters and for the settings and the places where they're in, and really bring their day-to-day lives to life on the page, I think.
Well, and it's like there, when we talk about a little detail earlier in the book, she had said as a boy, he liked to put ketchup on everything. And then, well, not earlier in the story, because the story sort of goes back, and she does a lot in a short story. I think the first sentence in that story is, she walked in on a man making a ketchup sandwich.
And then she goes back to when they're kids.
Yeah.
And then back to adults.
All in a short story. So... another thing you said a lot of clever things, Sarah. Another thing you said.
Likewise.
Well, she was doing this household chores. She didn't make it a big thing. And that is something that I noticed from this, that I noticed in life. Growing up still, kids came to school with their milk in jars. Jam jars. Things were all recycled, the wax paper, like the bread bags, and now it's like, oh, this is all new and it's all green. And I'm not complaining about that. I definitely like the idea of green, but sometimes I sit back and say, and that was just how we did it. And then because there were also people from the Depression who didn't waste anything, and you didn't waste those kind of things on the farm, definitely. But then came the time where it was women were getting freer. You wanted that time to write or whatever. So it took a great deal for people to then turn to convenient things. It was like, can I do this? Can I, is this okay? And then then it's back again. Then switches.
We've had that kind of cultural flip flop. I think for a long time, convenience was the new exciting thing. And here's canned food, here's frozen food, here's disposable stuff. When I was a kid, A lot of kids would bring like Lunchables to lunch with them, or Dunkaroos, or all this stuff with like a lot of plastic packaging that they would just throw away. And I think now it's almost flipped back in the opposite direction, where everyone's trying, like you said, to be more green, which is great, but it's like balancing that with the convenience and not spending all day in the kitchen making your kids lunch.
Right.
Where do you find that balance?
You could be taking them for a walk or spending time with them, playing a video game with them, like, or whatever. There are other ways. So yeah, it does bring that flip flop around. And when you talk about the convenience food, that was definitely brought up once again in home furnishings, where her husband worked. You know, it was like frozen food is better than fresh. And I remember almost that idea being sold to people, like, you know, it keeps all the nutrients in, and it keeps all of this. And, you know, you didn't see regular orange juice, darn it. You saw Tang, because that's what the astronauts drank. So, so it is very interesting to see the flip flop, and you forget about those changes, but it's brought back to me in those books because she did it. And I'll think about sitting around a table or whatever and hearing a conversation and going, oh, yes, that's right. I do remember that.
Yeah. And I like how her work, especially some of the older ones, do kind of show a slice of life that's from a slightly older time. But like we said, like, they still feel so fresh and so relevant today, I think, because the people feel real, and there's certain things about human nature that just don't change.
Relationships.
Relationships and the psychology, and it feels very contemporary in that way.
Well, I feel I wanted to bring up this subject. We had been talking earlier in the green room about the idea that growing up in Southern Ontario, it occurred to me, why wasn't I encouraged to read her books? Yeah. And then we found out that she was banned in her county, Huron County, for the lives of women and girls. The lives of
girls and women. Yeah,
she was banned for that because you said, you read that one, there was a lot of talk of abortion or you know, those kind of
birth control, like those types of topics.
So since I was ending high school in 1979, that would explain why that wasn't put in there. So it was still a point of female issues at that point here, and so she did write ahead of her time. I think on some of those issues.
Yeah, which is interesting, because by today's standards, like, you see lots of books and stories that deal with those topics, so it doesn't feel as daring or as controversial, I think, but in a way also because she encapsulates it in a way that feels like these are real people and these are small events. It doesn't feel like she's trying to make some giant political statement or going for shock value. It just feels like these are humans and these are their lives and this is what's happening in the story. But yeah, I can see how at the time maybe it would have been more shocking to people. Yeah, that's interesting.
And I also wanted to bring up the fact that I'm trying to. Sarah, you start. You start the next thing.
Well, this might not be the topic you were thinking of, but one thing that I love about her is that she's just such an avowed short story writer, because that's something that, you know, there aren't as many writers who are known for short stories or who have made really a whole career out of short stories as novelists. And I think short story collections are a lot harder to sell than novels. Most readers, I think, especially people who kind of look more for commercial fiction, they'll pick up a novel before they'll pick up like a collection of short stories. And a collection is harder to pitch because you can't necessarily say, like, here's the story, here's what it's about, here's the world of it. It's more about, do people like that writer? So it's harder to sell that unless you're already established. But she talked about how when she was early in her career, she faced a lot of pressure to write novels, and people would say, like, the short stories are basically practice, like when you're going to write a quote unquote real book. And when she met her editor, who she ended up working with throughout her career, he basically told her, like, no, your short stories are wonderful. Like, these are the end goal. I'll publish these. You don't have to write a novel if you don't want to. But I think, especially for me as someone who's come to love short stories more over time, I like how she just committed to that and made a career out of it.
And no, it is definitely true. We do not give short stories their credit. We think of novels as being serious, and I think that's something she had to work through in her life too, because it was always, oh, I finished this. Now I have time. I'm going to write that novel. I'm going to write that novel, until she finally realized, no, I am a short story writer. And I think that does stop a lot of people that would be writing short stories. Of course, yes, Susan, would be writing short stories. They feel like they have to write a novel. So I pledge, Sarah, that when you finish your anthology of short stories, I will put them on. Okay, I will definitely. I've been doing a lot of short stories because in life it's kind of nice to be able to pick up a short story and read it in an afternoon.
And her stories, I mean, like we said, she covers so much in there that they almost leave you with as much to think about and to feel about as many novels do. So
it leaves
she's not skimping.
There's an intensity that there may not be in longer fiction.
Yeah, that's true.
It's all happening right there, and so all the feelings are very on surface.
Yeah,
Susan B. Marcus, author Susan B. Marcus says, I actually prefer a book of short stories like Karen Russell's collection. And I will check those out, but I would also like to say that I actually prefer a book of short stories like Susan B. Marcus's collection. And thank you, Susan. It's good to see you.
Two writers I will both have to go and look up now.
Susan actually just published hers, and it was, once again, she was going to write a novel and then realized, this is a short. I was a little disappointed in that one because I had read it thinking I want more, so she'll have to write more short stories on that subject. Which,
well, you can always write more.
Oh, now Susan is blushing. Susan, stop blushing. Here's a question from Brian. For you, it just says Sarah on it. Okay. Sarah, how about a short story about a pug who becomes a scene-stealing video star? Purely fictional, of course.
Purely fictional. I mean, I'm ready for that. I know one person at least who would read it, who is my lap companion here. I think I wrote a script years ago that had a pug in it, but I don't think I've ever written anything else that has a pug. But I should bring that back because they're so entertaining.
Trademark thing for you, like in every story, a pug makes an appearance.
Well, there's like the author, I think Chris Van Allsburg was his name. He's a children's writer. He wrote the book Jumanji and some other famous kids books, and he also, I think, illustrated them. But I think he had a what's it called? A bull terrier, the ones that are like black and white with kind of long noses. He had one of those, and so in all of his books, there would be at least one bull terrier in the illustration somewhere. So maybe I should have like a pug make a cameo in everything I write.
Her cameo pug, and then people will just buy the books to find out where the pug fits in.
Exactly. It's like, where's Waldo? Where's William?
into all of these stories. So there's still so much to say on Alice Munro and the different stories. But if you had one sentence that sums up to you, I shouldn't put you on the spot like this, but you are a writer, so let's go for it. To sum up how you feel about her writing, what would you be there?
Maybe a lot and a little, because like we're saying, I mean, most of her stories are short, and she tends to pick topics that might on the surface seem like they're kind of quotidian, or like there's not that much big exciting stuff going on. There aren't like murders and earthquakes and that kind of thing, but there's so much drama and so much intensity within those stories, and also pretty complex plots and large casts of characters. And like we said, she'll cover large swaths of time and jump around in time. So even though her stories are shorter than a typical novel, like she just packs so much in there. And I think as you read them, you can reread her stories multiple times and just dig into the surface and discover so much more on every reading.
It's not one sentence, Sarah.
Sorry.
No. It was a
Started with one sentence and then became many.
It was a very good roundup. No, there's a lot of thoughts. There's a lot of thoughts to put into who she is as a writer. And when you were talking, see, you always inspire my thoughts. When you were talking, when you said there's like back and forth, I think about those. Her writing is not sitcoms, but I think about sitcoms like Malcolm in the Middle, where they have 3 different storylines and they finish them all up in half an hour. And I think, how clever is that? Like, how much writing does it take to get all the details to work to finish 3 different stories? And I think that's very much on a Alice Munro level, but very much what you end up feeling afterwards. You're like, how does she do that?
That's a great comparison. Well, and also because she has a way of like kind of she's subtle about it. Like she'll sort of plant the seeds for, here are the things that are going to be important in this story, here are the themes, but you don't necessarily notice them at first when they come up, or you don't consciously register like, oh, this is going to be important, or there's going to be a conflict here or something. It just kind of has a way of just building, and you don't quite sense that it's building until it's already there. Then it's like, oh, okay, wow, this is something big. But I guess that makes me believe more, like you said, that she's a plotter. There must be a lot of work that she has done intentionally to kind of plant those things, but it feels so natural.
No, so like when she says she walked into the kitchen and saw a man making a ketchup sandwich. And then we reference the fact that he liked ketchup as a kid, which means he's not going to forget that kind of magical relationship they had as children either, that he's a sentimentalist, that he doesn't let go of things he likes. And all of that is said with, I walked into the kitchen and the man was making a ketchup sandwich.
Yeah. Which is also just a great, intriguing opening. Like, who is this man? Why is he important? Why is the ketchup sandwich important?
Who eats a ketchup sandwich?
That is true.
I can safely say I've made it through these years without having done so.
Yes.
I have, yes.
I like ketchup, but not just ketchup.
No, I can't even imagine. So I would say, when we talk about authentic voices here on Fika, which I think is important to writing, Alice Munro is about as authentic as you're going to get. Her writing is honest, if not comfortable, always, and it does make you reflect on the people and your own lives.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it.
Definitely. And and we have 163 short stories to read.
I know. And she's in retirement, but there have been some questions over the years of, will she ever write anything again? So maybe she'll fit in another one under the wire. Who knows? I'm rooting for it.
It's my husband said this morning, well, isn't Alice Munro still alive? And I'm like, yes. And she says, well, why didn't you ask her to the show? And I'm like, oh my gosh, because I would never have the courage to. Plus, she is retired and she deserves that retirement. She
deserves a break, but
she does not need the likes of me knocking on her door and saying, please, Alice. Like, I mean, we're beyond that. This is writing royalty, if there ever.
Yeah. No, by all accounts, she's supposed to be very, very friendly and very nice.
So Alice, if you ever in this world, I can't believe I called you Alice, Miss Munro. If you're ever in this world and of Fika and you happen to see this, you are always invited. I did not invite you for any other reason than I feel like you deserve all the peace you can get for the joy that you have given us.
Yeah.
And Sarah, we have to say goodbye again. But I'm sure you'll be back.
You know where to find me.
So, in the internet, online.
Yes, always there.
Sarah lives in the internet for me. So thank you and take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Okay.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. This is wonderful.
Okay. Bye-bye. And I'm going to press the wrong way. Okay. All right, everybody. I'm going to close down the comment section now, so don't type something that I'm not going to see. Thanks for everybody who did comment and It was great spending time with you all. Again, I'll see you all next week. And until then, may your coffee be hot and your story sweet. Thank you for listening, everyone.